Welcome back, viewers, to the latest researches and news. Viewers, Ethiopia just wrapped up a 40-day national dialogue conference involving roughly 4,000 participants, with the African Union's own High Representative and a former Kenyan president standing on stage at the closing ceremony. The government is calling it a major success. But here's the question we're actually going to dig into today. With the country's most active armed conflicts almost entirely absent from the room, can this dialogue realistically move Ethiopia any closer to peace? Let's break it all down. Viewers, on August 22nd, the closing ceremony of Ethiopia's National Dialogue Conference was held. The conference itself ran for 40 days, and roughly 4,000 people took part, drawn from different ethnic communities, political parties, religious leaders, youth groups, women's representatives, and the diaspora. African Union High Representative Olusegun Obasanjo and former Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta were both present at the closing ceremony. A 40-day process involving 4,000 participants across these many different sectors of society is, on paper, a genuinely large-scale undertaking. This isn't a small symbolic gathering. It's a substantial national process in terms of scale and time invested. The government is describing this as a major success. Official statements claim that this dialogue built consensus around the country's deep-rooted issues. 8 major agenda items were reportedly discussed: nation building, the federal structure, the status of Addis Ababa, religious affairs, rule of law, corruption, socio-economic issues, and peace building. According to officials, around 400 recommendations were produced as a result, covering 8 broad national issues, and producing 400 recommendations sounds comprehensive on the surface. But the real test of a process like this isn't the number of recommendations it generates. It's whether the parties actually capable of implementing peace on the ground were part of shaping them in the first place. So here's the real question. Can this national dialogue actually move Ethiopia toward peace? This isn't a simple question to answer. The first thing to understand is that this dialogue took place under the federal government's own framework. Tigray's government were almost entirely absent from this process. The Tigray government rejected the national dialogue outright, saying that until the Pretoria Agreement is fully implemented and fundamental issues like Western Tigray are resolved, dialogues like this cannot be meaningful. In Amhara region, Fano also did not take part in this process. In Oromia, groups like the Oromo Liberation Army remained outside it as well. This is really the central weakness of the entire process. When the country's most active armed conflicts involve exactly the groups that chose not to participate, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, Fano, and the Oromo Liberation Army, the dialogue's recommendations were shaped almost entirely without input from the parties whose cooperation would actually be needed to implement peace on the ground. When the actual key players in the country's most active armed conflicts are not present at the table, how much can the dialogue's recommendations realistically be implemented on the ground? This is a major open question. A national consensus process can produce excellent recommendations in principle, but recommendations aren't self-enforcing. They require buy-in from the people who control territory, weapons, and populations. Without that, the risk is that this becomes a set of well-intentioned proposals that simply can't be carried out where they matter most. On the other hand, the government's argument is that this dialogue wasn't only meant for armed groups, it was meant for the whole of society. According to this view, if civil society, religious leaders, and ordinary citizens can build consensus, that itself can create political pressure. Obasanjo himself said at the closing ceremony that this dialogue could serve as an example for the rest of Africa. There's a real argument here. Broad societal consensus can, over time, create pressure that influences armed actors indirectly, especially if it shapes public opinion and international perception. But this kind of indirect pressure typically works over a much longer time frame and doesn't address the immediate active fighting happening right now. The reality on the ground tells a different story. Tension in Tigray remains high. Recent drone strikes have reached as far as Mekelle. Western Tigray remains unresolved. In Amhara region, fighting against Fano continues, and reports continue to emerge about the Eritrea-Tigray government alignment known as SIMDO. In a situation like this, even if the National Dialogue's recommendations were implemented, would that actually be enough to bring these armed groups to the table? This is the core contradiction of the entire story. At the exact moment the government is celebrating a large-scale national consensus process, we've been separately covering drone strikes, frontline battles, alliance building among armed groups, and a leadership meeting in Tigray investigating suspected intelligence leaks. These two realities, the diplomatic celebration in Addis Ababa and the active fighting we've been tracking across multiple fronts, are happening in parallel, almost as if they belong to two separate storylines about the same country. Looking at history, Ethiopia has held dialogues like this before. But until the actual balance of power shifts and the real stakeholders are willing to make serious concessions, consensus on paper doesn't change reality on the ground. This is a pattern we've seen repeatedly across the stories we've covered. The 2022 Pretoria Agreement itself is a clear example, where an agreement existed on paper for nearly 4 years without full implementation, which is part of what has driven the current escalation in the first place. A new set of recommendations without the direct participation of the Tigray government Fano or the Oromo Liberation Army risks following the same trajectory. So for now, here's a fair way to summarize it. The National Dialogue Conference was officially a success, and the government is presenting it as a major achievement. But Tigray, Amhara, and Oromia's active conflict zones remained largely outside this process. Because of that, this dialogue's real-world impact could remain limited, unless direct and genuine negotiations eventually take place between the federal government and these armed groups themselves. In the coming weeks, what will really matter is watching what practical steps the government takes to implement these recommendations, and how seriously the armed groups involved in this conflict actually treat this process. For now, this dialogue looks like a political statement more than a turning point, a significant undertaking on paper, but one that unfolded largely apart from the very conflicts it hopes to eventually resolve. Real peace, based on everything we've covered across our recent videos, still appears to be a long way off. We'll keep watching closely to see whether this changes in the weeks ahead. Subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss the next update.